So what shall we call you now? The former ambassador to the US or the expelled ambassador from the US?
Well, I think in both cases it's former. Whether the mode of your departure is irrelevant to becoming a former.
Would even Madiba be persona non grata to the US these days?
I think particularly Madiba would not be welcomed for his views, because I think his views are antithetical to what is going on. His views are about finding the middle ground, whereas there are those who are comfortable on the extremes. His views are about talking about things, whereas others threaten things. His views are about negotiating solutions, whereas others say my way or the highway. So
Well,
Madiba,
you did your arms like Trump even when you said my way or the highway.
yeah. In the very kind of polarizing world we're living in, people want to have the assurance that you must be aligned to them. That there's no place for the niceties like non-alignment.
We've got a lot to talk about. Shall we sit down inside and do it?
No problem.
Sure. Let's go. Ibrahim Rasool. Race beta, and then persona non grata. And then inside the Breitbart piece as well, Islamist, insinuations of anti-Semite. I don't know if they directly called you that. Did it hurt you?
Well, those assaults on your character and your personality are designed to hurt. And when it goes against everything that you stand for, it's particularly hurtful. But I think it was more shocking for me that it could be the case that they make against me, because I've walked with a confidence that people who know me, whether in South Africa, whether in the world, whether in the USA, generally don't use those kind of epithets against me. And so it's hurtful, but it's more shocking that it's used against you.
Did it anger you?
I have learned over the years that cowboys don't cry. And so anger is there, but it's not the kind of anger that becomes outrage. It becomes the kind of anger that you try to manage and deal with and give direction to. And so, yeah, so I think that there is that, but it's a contained and directed anger as opposed to simply an outrage that has no direction and no motive.
It's probably a sign of the times that you get expelled from the country on Twitter or X by Marco Rubio. Did you have any inkling that it was coming before the tweet?
I knew that I was in a very tenuous and vulnerable position from the moment I was announced as the candidate for ambassador by the presidency. That's the day that the assaults started. That's the day that I saw how almost every day, and then every second day and every third day, you would have something on Breitbart, something on X, something in social media, finding its way into mainstream press and all of those kind of things. So I've never settled entirely, and I knew that the first objective was to prevent me being credentialed by President Trump. And when that objective failed and I got credentialed by President Biden in his last week in office, I then saw the reaction. The reaction was one of pure anger that they had been outmaneuvered in their plan to not credential me in the Trump Oval Office. And so I then had a greater sense of my vulnerability. But I just kept on and endured, in a sense, the kind of vile things that were said about me, and really acted with a greater urgency to get the job done.
Yeah, you've used Breitbart and mainstream media in a sentence. That's another sign of the times. Maybe I'm just getting old. I don't know. What was the most vile thing that was said or written about you?
Look, I think that they used words that I have dedicated my life against. Extremism, jihadism, terrorism. I don't mind Islamist because that's part of your rites of passage as a young Muslim growing up anywhere in the world. And then by association, dealing with me being a Hamas supporter and a Taliban kind of supporter. And of course, the World for All Foundation does work with those kind of groups. We do mediation, peacemaking work about it. Whole books have been written about that. So I think that those are the ones. I think what is particularly insulting is the idea of being a race baiter. As a victim of racism, having gone to prison for racism, having been banned by racists, and all, and your distinguishing feature in your life is your fight against racism. I think for someone who has insulted his own president in far worse and vile ways, for him to call me a race baiter, I think that's particularly low. And so, yeah, unfortunately, the lies are so outrageous that they are not believable for people who know you.
Well, Rubio and Trump have both called each other all sorts of names, but that's all forgiven, so maybe there'll be forgiveness at some point for you later on. To that point of race baiter and the extract from which he took his, drew his conclusion, so you were on some sort of symposium, or it was a forum online, MISTRA. You're giving an analysis on the United States. You mention white supremacism, maybe not directly, but you couch it, and you can correct me at any point if this is wrong. But for the sake of sort of brevity, I just want to move this on. So you suggest there's something deeper going on civilizationally, culturally going on, which drives Trump and the rise of the right everywhere else. And there's a lot of white people who are feeling this connection to populists like Trump. It honestly, it doesn't seem like a revolutionary analysis. It's something people have been speaking about for a long, long time. But the question is, should an ambassador be saying that on that forum at that particular time when they are already gunning for South Africa?
I think that when an ambassador feeds back to the intelligentsia of his own society an analysis in order to adjust that society's expectations of how to do business with the United States, then they have to take into consideration that you are not dealing, for example, with an Obama White House. You are not dealing with a Democratic White House, even though there are contradictions there. You are dealing with something fundamentally different that goes back into our own reptilian memory about how to deal with a particular phenomenon. And I've never at all called a personality a white supremacist or even a party a white supremacist. What I was dealing with was the phenomenon that we were encountering, and that it was not a phenomenon that was happy to be confined to its own country, but it was a phenomenon that was aggressively being exported. If you look at, for example, the way in which Keir Starmer was under attack in Britain by the high priests of that phenomenon, the way in which the AFD, the Alternative für Deutschland, was being helped in their election campaign in Germany by that same kind of phenomenon, then you begin to understand that if you don't explain the context that has changed fundamentally, you are missing the point about why we are being punished for being South Africa by removing our aid and our PEPFAR money for HIV and AIDS and the USAID money, etc., etc., then you will understand why our Afrikaner community in South Africa is being elevated to the status of being the oppressed, being subject to a genocide, being subject to land confiscations. Why? Because, you see, that interference in the South African politics invites a narrative that must explain why we are the subject, why we are in the eye of the storm. An ambassador does not sit passively and allow lies to be spread about his country and take root, and policies to be based on it, and actions that are predicated on such a obvious and self-evident lie.
There's an article on the BBC that I was reading as I was coming in to meet with you. It spoke about the approach that it seems the UK is taking with this Trump administration. It's that wrangle behind closed doors, but say nothing in public. They seem to be afraid of the consequences of speaking out or diagnosing as you did. The fact that what you said led to your expulsion and caused all of this that has happened and rippled downstream, does that mean it was regrettable, even if what you think you said was right?
No, I stand by what I said and the analysis of that phenomenon that I spoke about. I think that there's always what ifs. But the fact of the matter is that we are a country that is proud. They're already visiting consequences upon us. It was not as if we're trying to avoid something. It was as if that we were managing a punitive streak that had already been unleashed. And it was based on fundamental dishonesty and lies. And I think that
fundamental dishonesty and lies on white genocide and expropriation of white
and
land.
all of those kind of things, and therefore the actions that followed that, such as cutting off 8 billion worth of aid already for South Africa.
So 8 billion, so that includes the climate fund,
Climate fund,
HIV/AIDS, PEPFAR,
PEPFAR, and the USAID funds, and the consequences of the World Health Organization funds being cut, etc., etc. So I think that we were already seeing those kind of consequences, and it was in that context that I think an analysis was important in order for us to recalibrate how we do business with the USA.
So do you feel your analysis has been vindicated by how they reacted?
My analysis was elicited by the action. That throughout those actions, we've been very conventionally diplomatic, smiled through the lies, smiled through the actions.
Who were you talking to during your diplomatic meetings while you were there?
No, I've reached over 20 offices of Congress members and senators, the think tanks, the business associations, where there were some people in place in the administration, we were reaching to them. But by and large, I think that the eliciting of that response also had to explain why that administration could not pick up a simple call from our principals to say congratulations for being elected on your post.
Oh, interesting, interesting. There's this impression given that you were barred from the real serious meetings because the Trump administration didn't want to meet with you. Is that accurate?
I think that that was the initial case until we were able to penetrate some of those.
And you say smile through the lies. Did they believe that there's a white genocide and that this expropriation is happening exclusively of Afrikaner white land? Did they truly believe it, or was it just something that they were sort of aligned with because the administration was going with
I think for the most part it was something that they were aligned with, but not something that they could really believe or understand. But in your very kind of hard MAGA influence groups, this was not simply believed, but it was necessary to a narrative that whites are endangered, and that that there was a need for a white reaction to the world, a reassertion of whiteness in the world, and hence the idea that if you didn't name the phenomenon, you would miss it. Because we were dealing with a very interesting intersection of whiteness in the USA and whiteness in South Africa.
And a touch point seems to be Elon Musk. Could
I
any of
think
this...
it's more than touch points, it's overlaps.
Tell me.
It's intersections. Because it's not an accident that prominent former South Africans were prominent MAGA engineers. And so when something has a hinge, it begins to look like a door. If it has two hinges and a handle, it begins to act like a door. If it opens and closes, it is a door. And so the fact of the matter is, that's the phenomenon that we are dealing with. And it was particularly important for the South African intelligentsia, who may have thought conventional diplomacy is the way. It's to ring the danger bell that we are in the crosshairs for who we are as South Africans and what we represent in the world, and the danger that we pose to a particular self-imagination of whiteness that I think was coming out of the USA.
So you say you had rung that alarm bell in your analysis. We've seen some of the consequences of it. What is expected beyond the 8 billion that you mentioned, 8 billion that South Africa has lost? What is expected is that it might get worse, with AGOA maybe falling apart, the trade deal. South Africans heavily reliant on it, not only for agricultural goods, but also car parts and so on. So how does President Ramaphosa deal with this? How does this administration deal with it? You've rung the alarm bell, so what does it mean? How do they engage with the US when it seems as if the punishment's coming anyway?
And that's exactly it. And so maybe drawing attention to a preset agenda is sometimes the best way to prevent that agenda from unfolding. And so I think I remain absolutely committed to a relationship with the USA, but not in a starry-eyed way, in an open, clear-eyed way, that we must understand who we are dealing with. That I think we must be able to understand what are our bottom lines beneath which we will not go, because I think that part of that entire imagination is the particular anger at South Africa for what it meant for the International Court of Justice and South Africa's charges of genocide against Israel. And so if you don't understand the idea that South Africa is seen as impudent for having thought that they could do that, and actually then having done it, and then sending an ambassador who says, my bottom line is that this is not negotiable, then you begin to understand why jihadist, Islamist, terrorist becomes Hamas supporter becomes absolutely crucial to deal with that ambassador, and to put a particular color that South Africa's case is not as human rights and values based as they think it is. It is because there are people who have particular sympathies who are driving that particular line.
I mean, I remember when this was done with Naledi Pandor as well, pictures of her family on Eid and, you know, sort of suggesting this is why she supports Palestine. All that being said, is this your analysis again, or is it something that they actually told you? Did they say, take the ICJ case off the table, bend the knee, and then everything will be okay?
That was a refrain from Democrat to Republican, particularly hard by MAGA. You won't even get past the door of trade for as long as the ICJ case.
Did they say this to you directly?
That's what I was told. You won't even get through the discussions of trade.
But I mean, how does that work? Because as far as I understand, with even US allies like Spain and Ireland joining into the lawsuit at the ICJ, it seems as if the horse had bolted anyway. I don't know how the legal mechanisms work, but I mean, okay, South Africa went, South Africa was the first, but this thing has gone far and beyond South Africa. South Africa opened the door to that, right? So what even happens, I don't understand, if South Africa says, okay, hang on, we're pulling the lawsuit. What does that even do? I mean, I think it would still, whatever's going on at the ICJ might still continue without South Africa.
No, I don't think it is even material that there are other countries involved. The one that brings the moral gravitas to the case is South Africa. The one that brings the entire history of Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Oliver Tambo.
Do you think it means that much to them, though? That's what I'm asking. It means that much to them to get South Africa to drop the case, and then you'll be our friends, and all the aid money will be restored?
The last victims of white supremacy globally has been South Africa. But South Africa did something counter-instinctive, where we reconciled with our former oppressors, and it gave us a moral authority beyond imagination. We remain the absolute moral authority of right and wrong, because you must also add to that the fact that we had a second miracle in the last 30 years. The ANC lost the elections, accepted the results, formed the government of national unity, and that is counter-instinctive to even your January the 6th movement in the USA. And so when it comes to doing the right thing, South Africa is seen as the gold standard. And that's what hurts. The fact that the last victims of colonialism, apartheid, and supremacy have the first voice against a genocide in the Middle East.
Canada, Mexico, Greenland, Panama, you name it. A lot of countries in the crosshairs. And again, it seems to be this option of you cave or you suffer. South Africa is already suffering economically as a result of what the US has done so far. There's the potential threat of much, much more damage. Would it, even if you disagree with it in principle, if it helps to send a white ambassador to the US right now, that Trump would maybe warm to a bit more than someone like yourself, would it be the right thing to do?
The color is not the problem. It's the value space that is the problem. And that's why I was very clear, because there is this pressure on President Ramaphosa to find a white person of a particular ilk to go there.
When you say particular ilk, what do you mean?
No, I mean, the name is very public. I'm not going to add to it, but
it was suggested Tony Leon.
There's a few of those ones. I think what we need is someone who understands the heartbeat of South Africa, for example, for Palestine.
But if it saves the economy for someone of a particular ilk to just go there and play ball as a diplomat?
No, I think that, foreign policy is the function of values and interests. And the point that I've made often is that black South Africans in the 1980s petitioned the White House to institute sanctions against South Africa, even though black livelihoods may be affected. That is the history and the legacy of sacrifice for principle and for values.
Good point.
And so we don't simply make a trade-off between values and interest, but pragmatically, we were prepared and we had put a deal on the table that understood the core fundamentals of our values, but that was pragmatic on other things that would advance our interests as well.
How was your meeting with President Ramaphosa upon your arrival? There was a suggestion that he was maybe going to try and clip your wings a little bit and get you to not make too much of a meal of your re-arrival back to South Africa.
No, President Ramaphosa, we've not met yet, but we have spoken.
Okay.
And President Ramaphosa has the responsibility to salvage as much as what we can pragmatically from the USA, and so there's no standoff.
Has he asked you to be cautious?
I think I would expect that his call to tone down the reception was to prevent a display of anti-Americanism. And I'm hoping that my own commitment to the relationship with the USA is intact. I cannot 3 months ago go and say why we need this relationship with the USA, and then 3 months later, after I am declared persona non grata, come back on an anti-American binge. That would be an assault on my own integrity. And so I remain absolutely committed to it. I remain committed to the idea that while the US is number 2 in volume in trade to China, it is number 1 in value because we export manufactured goods. We must salvage all of those kind of things. But I would also continue to say that we don't trade away our moral authority in the world at the altar of only some interests that we have.
Is the relationship with China, for example, enough to fill the gaps economically that are lost by the US pulling out?
I don't think so. And that's why the relationship with the United States is absolutely valuable. And if my being declared persona non grata allows for a reopening of some of those things, then so be it. But I don't think our relationships with BRICS or simply with the Global South is sufficient for what our country and our economy requires.
Just a big picture, zoom out here for a sec. We first met when you were ambassador in your first stint. It was a little bit longer than this one. Barack Obama was the president. It was a different time. If in a sentence or two you could compare that time to this time, how would you describe it?
I think that time was intellectual. This time is anti-intellectual. That time you could trade truth. This time you can't. And for instance, that time there was discomfort with positions I had taken, but later appreciation for the way in which I could play a moderating role, for example, on the Arab Spring.
Right.
And so that time, when the first Muslim Brotherhood delegation arrived in the USA, they came to dinner at my house, and the next morning I had dinner with some of the breakfast with some of the Obama people in order to frame the way in which some of those discussions could happen. That was uncomfortable. That was the diplomacy of Ubuntu, not conventional diplomacy. But there was an intellectual appreciation for the role that South Africa plays in the world, and that it can moderate an Islamist tendency in Egypt, Tunisia, and other places, and a mediating role. Whereas this time there is no such appreciation for a role that South Africa can play in mitigating a world that is more populist.
Ebrahim, I've got to keep these interviews to around about 26 minutes or less, so unfortunately we're out of time, but much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.